Chapter 14. The Ten Commandments as a Moral Framework. When we think about the Ten Commandments, many view them as rigid laws that define a clear line between right and wrong. But what if the commandments weren't intended to serve as an exhaustive list of do's and don'ts? Instead, perhaps they act as a broader moral framework designed to guide us as individuals through the complexities of life, with guilt and our conscience serving as the compass. The commandments provide principles that leave room for interpretation, not in terms of their core meaning, but in how we apply them in our daily lives. This is where the uniqueness of each person's conscience comes into play. What one person views as a breach of these commandments may not invoke guilt in another. It's not just about breaking a rule, it's about the internal response that comes with it. A framework for the conscience. Take, for example, the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill." On the surface, this seems straightforward. You should not take the life of another person. However, over time, people have interpreted this commandment differently based on their conscience. Some might extend this to include the treatment of animals or the environment, when others might focus only on human life. The commandment doesn't lay out every scenario. It leaves room for each person to navigate how it applies to their life. This flexibility is intentional. The commandments work by activating our conscience, and it's our conscience that alerts us to wrongdoing through guilt. In many ways, the commandments are less about listing specific sins and more about highlighting areas where our moral compass is at play. If you violate a commandment and feel guilt, that guilt is your conscience recognizing the wrong. For instance, the commandment, "Thou shalt not steal," seems simple, but it raises complex questions. Is it stealing to take something in a life or death emergency? What if you believe the owner would want you to take what you need to save a life, but you are mistaken? What if you go to work and feel bad, so you only work at half your normal efficiency? Are you stealing from your boss? What if your boss knows you are human and will have days that are more productive than others? Again, the specifics are not outlined, and they don't need to be. What matters is the internal reckoning, how your conscience reacts and whether or not guilt arises. Guilt is the indicator of sin. Guilt is at the heart of sin. When we experience guilt, it's our signal that something we've done has violated our internal sense of right and wrong, whether it aligns with a specific commandment or not. In the Garden of Eden, it wasn't merely the act of eating the fruit that created the problem. It was the guilt that followed, the recognition that Adam and Eve had done something they believed was wrong. Guilt is the emotional residue that clings to us when our actions conflict with what we know to be right. In this way, guilt becomes the true marker of sin. If a person does something they believe is wrong, they will carry that guilt, whether or not the act violates a specific commandment. The Ten Commandments, then, function as broad moral guideposts, pointing us toward areas where we might stumble and feel guilt. But they leave room for our conscience to define the specifics based on our individual experiences and beliefs. For example, the commandment, "Thou shalt not bear false witness," doesn't spell out every scenario where dishonesty might apply. It doesn't explain every type of lie or its consequences. Instead, it leaves the work of discernment to the individual conscience. If you feel guilty after telling a lie, it's your conscience telling you that you've crossed the line. But if you believe the lie was told to protect someone from harm, and you feel no guilt, it may not be classified as a sin in your own moral reckoning. The non-specificity of the Ten Commandments. The power of the Ten Commandments lies in their non-specificity. They are designed to provide a broad moral foundation while encouraging us to develop our own internal moral framework. The commandments aren't meant to cover every possible situation. They are meant to set the stage for how we approach life's moral dilemmas, using our conscience as the ultimate guide. This is why the commandments are so enduring. They aren't rigid rules that can be easily outdated. They are timeless principles that can be applied across centuries, cultures, and situations. But ultimately, it's up to us as individuals to determine how they resonate within us. The commandments set the tone, but it is our conscience that carries the melody. Living within the framework. The Ten Commandments continue to serve as guideposts for us today, just as they did when they were first given. So we must remember that their true power comes not from the specifics of the laws themselves, but from the framework they create for us to interact with our own conscience. Each person's journey through life is different, and the commandments provide moral boundaries that allow us to navigate our own path without becoming lost in the complexities of legalism. Ultimately, it's not the act of simply following the commandments that makes us righteous. It's how we respond to the guilt or freedom our actions create within us. The commandments help us recognize when we are in line with the Creator's will and when we are not, based on the internal gauge of guilt. So when we consider the commandments, let's view them as an invitation to constantly examine our conscience. Let's see them as the framework through which we learn to become the avatar for the Creator, by responding not just to the laws themselves, but to the guilt or freedom they invoke in us as we live our lives. The guidelines are there to help us keep our vessel pure, but they require us to listen to our inner voice, to the part of us that knows when we have stepped out of alignment.